Hello students, this video is being recorded in the summer of 2020, right after the end of the spring semester and in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Since we do not yet know for sure what format our classes will take in the fall, and since there's some likelihood that at least some of us, both students and faculty, will have to be away from campus for a time should the mitigation plans prove ineffective, or should compliance with or enforcement of public health guidelines prove impossible, I am preparing a video version of each of my lectures for the class to have it ready if and when it is needed. It's also the case that necessary distancing requirements in the classrooms may make it impossible that the entire class can be in the same room at the same time. In that case, those whose turn it is to stay away from campus may find these video lectures a better option than relying on a live classroom feed via Zoom or some other technology. So if you're watching this video, it means that we are, for reasons of public and personal health, still unable to meet together in a traditional face-to-face classroom format. All the same, I'll continue to do my best to teach you what I know with whatever tools I have at my disposal. Enjoy the lecture. So we have already introduced Daniel Webster and discussed his famous eulogy to Adams and Jefferson. And now we turn to another Daniel Webster speech, his famous second reply to Hayne, given in the midst of a debate in the United States Senate in January of 1830. Now, we've mentioned how Webster had a reputation as being America's greatest orator, and mentioned briefly in the previous lecture Webster's defense of Dartmouth College in the Supreme Court case in 1819. Here's one of the many ways that Webster is commemorated. This is Webster Hall at Dartmouth, but he's also commemorated in a variety of ways in statues and busts and memorials throughout New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and indeed the rest of the nation. So here are some of the statues to Daniel Webster. The one on the far left is the statue of Webster that stands in front of the State House in Concord, New Hampshire. The next one is the Webster statue in front of the Massachusetts State House. The third is the statue of Webster in New York City. And you'll see on the New York City statue there is a passage right above the Webster name. The language there says liberty and union now and forever, one and inseparable, and that is the closing line of the reply to Hayne. You'll see on the far right another statue of Webster, and presumably all these statues remain standing, that the idiots haven't torn them down yet. And in any case, on the Webster statue in Washington on the far right, you'll see right above Webster's name a relief sculpture. And I'm going to show you a close-up of that. Here's the relief sculpture on the Washington, D.C. Webster statue, and it is a relief sculpture depicting Webster delivering his second reply to Hayne. The sculpture here is based on a famous painting. And here's the painting, and you'll see on the frame of the painting at the bottom here, again, that expression, liberty and union, now and forever, the closing words of the second reply to Hayne. Also depicted here is George P. Healy, who was the artist who completed the painting. Took him 7 years to do this, as he spent time doing close-up sketches of all the living members of the United States Senate who were still around when he did the painting, which was about 20 years after Webster had given the speech. Now, if you go to Faneuil Hall and go inside the famous Revolutionary Era building, you can see the George Healy painting hanging behind the stage. So now we turn to some of the basic questions regarding the second reply to Hayne. First, about its genre. I mentioned already that the speech occurred in the midst of a debate in the United States Senate, and that should be a pretty good clue that this is a deliberative speech. But as you'll see, reading through the speech, it also has very clear epideictic passages as well, and we'll focus on some of those as we go along. And then about the rhetorical situation, the exigence, the audience, and the constraints. Well, first, with regard to the exigence, there is an issue being debated in the Senate, but the issue that's being debated is not really the main focus of the debate between Webster and Hayne. The issue, or the resolution that's under consideration, is a resolution by Senator Foote of Connecticut regarding the sale of Western lands. But this leads to the involvement in the debate of a whole number of additional questions and disputes. And those include, among other things, the sense that there's a growing sectionalism between the North and the South, and that is mainly focused on the issue of slavery. And Webster also takes this opportunity in the context of that growing sectionalism to clarify the differences between North and South regarding their interpretation of the Constitution. So part of the exigence for Webster is the chance to expound on his understanding of the Constitution and to try to secure among American public opinion a strong consensus regarding his or the nationalist interpretation of the Constitution. Ultimately, this is a way of preventing what Webster sees as the danger of disunion, and ultimately then also the potential for a civil war. Now, this is 1830. It's 30 years before the actual Civil War, but the issues that led to the Civil War are already obvious to political leaders in Webster's time in 1830. And then, so who was the audience for the speech? Certainly the other senators in the United States Senate would be the ones voting on Foote's resolution. But because of the other issues involved, the other controversies, and especially because Webster uses the speech to expound on the Constitution, it's very clear that he has in mind a much wider audience. Webster spent a lot of time perfecting the final transcript of his speech. A stenographer took notes on the speech while Webster was delivering it. The shorthand notes were then transcribed longhand and then given to Webster, and he corrected and perfected the text before it went into print. But when it did go into print, it was widely circulated in both newspapers and in pamphlets and was read throughout the country. And one of the things then that this wider distribution to an extended audience accomplishes is it puts Webster's name and his defense of the Constitution in front of a much bigger constituency. Webster did have presidential ambitions, and much of his credibility as a presidential candidate rested on the text of this speech. We could also say, in a lot of ways, the speech is directed at us of later generations, because no less than any other generation of Americans, we need to know what the Constitution means and how it was constructed. Indeed, this question about the Constitution, the nature of the Constitution, the relationship of the national government to the state governments, these questions were the fundamental basis on which the Civil War was fought. Certainly it was about slavery, but the question of slavery, that is, who controlled laws regarding slavery, those were questions wrapped up in these issues of states' rights and the interpretation of the Constitution. And so we see then a fundamental speech, a speech that's fundamentally important for our own understanding of how our government works. And then we can talk about the constraints. And certainly the fact that this speech takes place in the context of a debate can speak to that. Webster is constrained in some ways by the things that Robert Hayne has already said. His speech is a reply to Hayne, and so the accusations and the comments and the interpretations of the Constitution that have been advanced by Hayne are things that constrain Webster's address. He's going to have to respond and offer a rebuttal or attack those misunderstandings that are part of Hayne's argument. We also know the wider terms of the disagreements between North and South, that forms some of the context for the speech, and so also then constrains what Webster can say. So we think, for instance, that Webster as a nationalist, Webster as a Northern senator, Webster as a representative of the state of Massachusetts, these are all positions that he takes which help to define what he will say and how he will say it in this speech. And then, of course, there is the language of the Constitution itself. Webster is a sort of conservative interpreter of the Constitution. And in that regard, he's looking closely at what the Constitution actually says. It's the text of the Constitution that also constrains his second reply to Hayne. So we said that the debate takes place on something called Foot's resolution, and that's named after the person who put it forward, Senator Samuel A. Foote of Connecticut, and it was a resolution that he introduced on the 29th of December in 1829. Now, the debate over this question occurs on and off over about a month, and it's not until toward the end of January that we get Webster's speech, the second reply to Hayne. But the Foote resolution, when you read it, it doesn't seem like it's terribly controversial or that it would be the origin of one of the most famous debates in American history. For all it said was resolved that the Committee on Public Lands be instructed to inquire and report the quantity of the public lands remaining unsold within each state and territory, and whether it be expedient to limit for a certain period the sale of the public lands to such lands only as have heretofore been offered for sale and are now subject to entry at the minimum price, and also whether the office of Surveyor General and some of the land offices may not be abolished without detriment to the public interest, or whether it be expedient to adopt measures to hasten the sales and extend more rapidly the survey of the public lands. So keep in mind, in 1829 and 1830, the United States only extends as far as the Mississippi River. There's a lot of unorganized territory. There are only at this time 24 states, and even some of those states have great tracts of federal public land within them. Well, one of the ways that the United States encouraged migration to the West and settlement of these unorganized areas was to sell land to people who were willing to move from the eastern seaboard, maybe especially people who were living in growing cities who wanted to get back to the land. In any case, the federal government would sell those lands. And so the question here is, should they do that more quickly or more slowly? The lands, in a sense, are part of the treasury of the United States because when these lands are sold, they become a source of income for the federal government. But the real question is how quickly do you want the population to move from the east to the west? And you can do that more quickly if you sell the lands more quickly. But of course, if you put more land for sale more quickly, the price of the land will not be as high because there'll be more available. There'll be a greater supply than there will be a demand. And so these are some of the questions involved in the debate simply over Foote's resolution. But there's also implicitly a rivalry here between North and South because the South wants to depict itself as an ally of the new Western states. And so the South is trying to encourage the quick sale of land so that more people will go to populate those Western states. And the North, for its part, doesn't want to too quickly lose the great force of laboring people who are working in the factories and in manufacturing in the eastern states. And so many of them, certainly Webster, wants to restrict the quick sale of land. So this Foote resolution is understood in the context of that South versus North rivalry. So here are the key issues in the debate, and we look at these with an image of Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina. We have that issue of Western land sales and the interests of the Western states in particular, and the sectional rivalries, North versus South. In the course of the debate, Hayne made some disparaging remarks about New England and about Massachusetts, and so Webster feels compelled to offer a defense of New England. And then there are the issues regarding the meaning or interpretation of the Constitution. And this dispute is understood in the context of the opposing political theories of Hayne and Webster. Hayne is an advocate of the Southern states' rights philosophy, whereas Webster takes a kind of nationalist view of the Constitution. And so also implied in this then is the question of states' rights. And states' rights, as you may know, remains a matter of political dispute well into the middle of the 20th century. Indeed, many of the issues surrounding the civil rights movement were opposed by those who took a states' rights position. And also implicitly and sometimes explicitly present in this dispute is the question of slavery. In 1830, slavery had been abolished in all of the northern states, but it remained a very powerful institution, very important economic institution in the southern states, including South Carolina. And so that's one of the sources of the great rivalry and even animosity between North and South as the context for the second reply to Hayne. So here are some of the critical questions we can ask about the debate. So here are some of the critical questions we can ask about the second reply to Hayne. First, what variety of means and images does Webster use to ridicule his opponent, Robert Hayne? And which of these images are especially aimed at Hayne's performance as an orator? So I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few moments. But here we want to pay attention as you're reading, not only to the discussion of the issues being debated, but also Webster's characterization of his opponent and how that characterization focuses specifically on his opponent's performance as an orator. And then in contrast to the Hayne character that's constructed by Webster, what is the persona of Webster himself that emerges from the text? That is, what sense do we get of Webster's ethos here? Who is Webster trying to portray himself to be in this speech? And then we can ask as well, how does Webster use historical narrative in the address? We saw he did this very well in the eulogy to Adams and Jefferson. But now the question is, how does historical narrative function in the context of this deliberative address? There are clearly important elements where that happens, and some of them, as I suggested before, have a clear epideictic flavor. So we want to look for those places in the address where Webster digresses from the immediate deliberative issues and reflects on different historical concerns and offers us some historical interpretation and narrative in a way as evidence for some of the claims he's making in his address. And then we can ask, how does Webster's oration perform the task of important public instruction? As I mentioned before, Webster certainly had in mind reaching a much wider audience, and once the speech is printed in the newspapers and in pamphlets and circulates widely, it becomes the basis for the way many common Americans understand the Constitution. So Webster, in effect, is teaching us how the Constitution works or what the Constitution means. And then finally, why do you suppose the peroration, which is the concluding portion of Webster's speech, why do you suppose the peroration to Webster's oration was published and read so widely as a school exercise? So indeed, in the 19th century, really up into the middle of the 20th century, those closing paragraphs of Webster's speech were memorized by school children. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that they contain really noble sentiments about what America is, what the Constitution means, and how important the union of the states is. As one commentator, one historian remarked, the men who starved to death in the Confederate prisons did so with the words of Webster's peroration on their lips. That is, it was the inspiration for many who 30 years after the speech enlisted and went to war to preserve the Union that he praised in the conclusion of this address. So before we turn to the speech itself, let me talk very briefly about the chapter that I've written on the second reply to Hayne. It's a long chapter, about 70 pages, and I've given you an excerpt from it that focuses mainly on the analysis of the text. But as I said in that essay, the clash, that is the debate between Webster and Hayne, was dramatic, and public attention was drawn to it both in Washington and beyond as word of the deliberative battle spread by newspaper throughout the nation. This was Webster's main chance, but the occasion was one for more than a theoretical dispute. He now had an appropriate opportunity to offer a spirited defense of Massachusetts, to ridicule Hayne's view of the Constitution, and to position himself as the leading spokesman for constitutional nationalism. But more important, perhaps, to Webster, Hayne's language had given him the chance to draw a contrast between the ideals of civic conduct, his ideals, which formed a fundamental part of his political theory, and those of Hayne, which threatened the Union. The second reply to Hayne, then, can be read not only as Webster's profound exegesis of the Constitution, but also as his performance enacting the politics that he believed would preserve the Union. So the point here is that in this Webster speech, you see not only a debate over all of these issues, the Constitution and the sectional rivalry and all of that, but you see also Webster embodying or enacting, demonstrating not only what Americans should believe, but how debate about issues like this should be conducted. And this goes back to one of those critical questions that we raised. How does Webster characterize Hayne and Hayne's oratory? And in contrast, how does Webster characterize himself? And part of the reason we focus on that is because we're looking not only for differences on positions regarding the Constitution and other issues, but also we're looking at differences about how they do deliberation. That is, how does each of these orators represent a model of or enactment of their particular political theory? And so it's important to look not only at what Webster says, but also how he says it and how he characterizes the way that Hayne is engaging in the debate. So Webster's remarks reveal his awareness of the bounds of propriety and the necessity of observing rules of decorum in public debate. Webster's gesture is not merely conventional debate form. Rather, it reveals a consciousness of appropriate civic conduct that informs both his political theory and his rhetorical strategy in the reply to Hayne. The contest with Hayne was as much about the style and manner in which public representatives conduct their affairs as it was about which view of the Constitution would prevail. Webster was contending not only for a constitutional doctrine, but indeed for a political way of life. For Webster, this was constitutional theory and prudent action. It was philosophy and performance. So let's turn now to the Webster speech and begin right at the beginning. These are the opening lines of Webster's second reply to Hayne. And we want to look closely here at the metaphoric image that Webster uses here to open the address. When the mariner has been tossed for many days in thick weather and on an unknown sea, he naturally avails himself of the first pause in the storm, the earliest glance of the sun, to take his latitude and ascertain how far the elements have driven him from his true course. Let us imitate this prudence, and before we float farther on the waves of this debate, refer to the point from which we departed, that we may at least be able to conjecture where we are now. I ask for the reading of the resolution before the Senate. Now, the resolution, of course, is Senator Foote's resolution on Western land sales, and that, at least nominally, is the subject of the debate. But notice here what Webster's doing. He's applying that metaphor of the mariner and the storm and the sea to the debate itself. He says we're going to locate our true course because we've been driven away from that course on the waves of this debate. So the debate itself is the sea or the waves. Obviously, the metaphor here is the ship of state, and the mariner, presumably Webster, takes this pause in the debate or pause in the storm to go back to the point from which they began, that is, to read the resolution which begins the debate. But then we can ask, what is it that has driven us away from the course? That is, what are the elements here in the metaphor? We need to ascertain how far the elements have driven him from his true course. What are those elements in the metaphor? And we could say the elements here, or that which has driven us off course, or the storm which has tossed us for many days, that's Robert Hayne and Robert Hayne's arguments in the debate. So then Webster characterizes the remarks of his opponent. We have thus heard, sir, what the resolution is, which is actually before us for consideration. And it will readily occur to everyone that it is almost the only subject about which something has not been said in the speech running through 2 days, by which the Senate has been entertained by the gentleman from South Carolina. Every topic in the wide range of our public affairs, whether past or present, everything general or local, whether belonging to national politics or party politics, seems to have attracted more or less of the honorable member's attention, save only the resolution before the Senate. He has spoken of everything but the public lands. They have escaped his notice. To that subject, in all his excursions, he has not paid even the cold respect of a passing glance. You can see here that he begins right away mocking and ridiculing Senator Hayne from South Carolina. Hayne doesn't seem to know what he's supposed to do in a debate. He's not paid any attention to the resolution which is under consideration. He's done all kinds of other things, but he hasn't paid attention to the real question before the Senate. Also, notice how Webster characterizes Hayne's debating, right? He's entertaining. So a serious senator wouldn't be described as having entertained his fellow senators, but this is one way that Webster seems to diminish the credibility of Robert Hayne. Notice also at the end of this passage here that we see something that's characteristic of Daniel Webster's oratorical style, and that is his use of repetition. He has a way of often saying the same thing several different ways to make sure that the point hits home. He says, for instance, throughout the second half of this passage, every topic in the wide range of our public affairs, whether past or present, everything general or local, whether belonging to national politics or party politics, seems to have attracted more or less of the honorable member's attention, save only the resolution before the Senate. So in one long sentence there, Webster has said basically Hayne hasn't addressed the issue before the Senate. But then he says it again 3 more times. He has spoken of everything but the public lands. They have escaped his notice. To that subject in all his excursions he has not paid even the cold respect of a passing glance. Now, those last three sentences there are completely superfluous in terms of content, but stylistically they are important to emphasize, again, that Hayne is inadequate as a debater. He seems not to know what to do. He doesn't understand that in a debate on a resolution, you're supposed to address the resolution. Then we get into this language that Hayne had introduced and which Webster responds to, which seems to invoke the drama of a duel. Of course, this was an age when dueling was still practiced, although illegal in many places. And it's also associated with that sort of Southern code of honor. And Webster dismisses all of that as inappropriate for a senator and something that should not be brought up in the context of a Senate debate. He says matches and overmatches, those terms are more applicable elsewhere than here and fitter for other assemblies than this. Sir, the gentleman seems to forget where and what we are. This is a Senate of equals, of men of individual honor and personal character, and of absolute independence. We know no masters. We acknowledge no dictators. This is a hall for mutual consultation and discussion, not an arena for the exhibition of champions. I offer myself, sir, as a match for no man. I throw the challenge of debate at no man's feet. So while even the popular opinion about the debate seems to read it as a kind of personal contest between Hayne and Webster, and certainly that's part of the language that Hayne invokes in attacking Webster, Webster dismisses that. So we see here again this effort to recharacterize the nature of deliberation and discussion in the Senate, that Hayne seems to be unaware of what's appropriate for the United States Senate. Notice also here again, Webster using that repetition, right? He says, this is a hall for mutual consultation and discussion, not an arena for the exhibition of champions. I offer myself, sir, as a match for no man. I throw the challenge of debate at no man's feet, saying the same thing two or three different ways. But the main thing here is that Webster is again mocking or ridiculing Hayne as being clueless about what is required in a Senate debate, and also, in a sense, disparaging that code of Southern honor where dueling was a commonplace practice between men who had insulted one another. Webster, however, doesn't shrink from getting personal in the debate when it's necessary or when he feels like it's called for because of something that Hayne has said. I can tell the honorable member, he says, once for all, that he is greatly mistaken and that he is dealing with one of whose temper and character he has yet much to learn. Sir, I shall not allow myself on this occasion, I hope on no occasion, to be betrayed into any loss of temper. But if provoked, as I trust I never shall be, into crimination and recrimination, the honorable member may perhaps find that in that contest there will be blows to take as well as blows to give, that others can state comparisons as significant at least as his own, and that his impunity may possibly demand of him whatever powers of taunt and sarcasm he may possess. I commend him to a prudent husbandry of his resources. So here Webster is suggesting, look, if you really want to get into it, Senator Hayne, I'll do that, but you should be warned that I won't hold back and that your reputation may be gravely damaged in a contest with the great Daniel Webster. Then, of course, not surprisingly, the issue of slavery comes up in the course of the debate. In his previous remarks, his first reply, Webster spoke of the Northwest Ordinance, and Hayne responded to that quite passionately. And Webster brings up that exchange in the second reply. He says, I spoke, sir, of the Ordinance of 1787, which is the Northwest Ordinance. I spoke, sir, of the Ordinance of 1787, which prohibits slavery in all future times northwest of the Ohio, as a measure of great wisdom and foresight, and one which had been attended with highly beneficial and permanent consequences. I suppose that on this point no two gentlemen in the Senate could entertain different opinions. But the simple expression of this sentiment has led the gentleman not only into a labored defense of slavery in the abstract and on principle, but also into a warm accusation against me as having attacked the system of domestic slavery now existing in the southern states. And of course, Webster does that only by implication and indirectly, but Hayne takes great offense at it. And so slavery, then, we see is part of the context in which this sectional rivalry that's playing out in the drama of this debate, which that sectional rivalry has to be understood. Then, of course, in his remarks in the debate, Hayne has occasion to attack Massachusetts and the northern states, especially because he sees them as trying to selfishly maintain as much of the laboring population as they can by not permitting a faster settlement of the West. And he has some disparaging things to say about New England, and in particular about Massachusetts. And not surprisingly, Webster offers a defense of the state he represents. Mr. President, he says, I shall enter on no encomium upon Massachusetts. Now, an encomium is like an epidictic speech of praise. And of course, Webster saying here he's not going to do it is just a way of introducing, in fact, that he actually does that. So, Mr. President, I shall enter on no encomium upon Massachusetts. She needs none. There she is. Behold her and judge for yourselves. There is her history. The world knows it by heart. The past, at least, is secure. There is Boston and Concord and Lexington and Bunker Hill, and there they will remain forever. The bones of her sons, falling in the great struggle for independence, now lie mingled with the soil of every state from New England to Georgia, and there they will lie forever. And, sir, where American liberty raised its first voice, and where its youth was nurtured and sustained, there it still lives in the strength of its manhood and full of its original spirit. If discord and disunion shall wound it, if party strife and blind ambitions shall hawk at it and tear it, if folly and madness, if uneasiness under salutary and necessary restraint shall succeed in separating it from that union, by which alone its existence is made sure, it will stand in the end by the side of that cradle in which its infancy was rocked. It will stretch forth its arm with whatever vigor it may still retain over the friends who gather round it, and it will fall at last, if fall it must, amidst the proudest monuments of its own glory and on the very spot of its origin. So under the pretense of not offering an encomium, Webster, of course, does that, and he praises Massachusetts here as the source and origin and birthplace of American liberty at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, right? And then he also indirectly characterizes the necessary consequences of Hayne's theory of the Constitution, and that is one that will lead to discord and disunion, right? Webster takes the Union as the support for liberty. And here then he's anticipating that closing statement of the speech, that peroration, liberty and union now and forever, one and inseparable. And so we're getting closer to what are the real and ultimate terms of conflict in this debate between Daniel Webster and Robert Hayne. And that is about the differing views of the Union. As Webster explains it, sir, We narrow-minded people of New England do not reason thus. Our notion of things is entirely different. We look upon the states not as separated, but as united. We love to dwell on that union and on the mutual happiness which it has so much promoted, and the common renown which it has so greatly contributed to acquire. In our contemplation, Carolina and Ohio are parts of the same country, states united under the same general government, having interests common, associated, intermingled, in whatever is within the proper sphere of the constitutional power of this government. We look upon the states as one. We do not impose geographical limits to our patriotic feeling or regard. We do not follow rivers and mountains and lines of latitude to find boundaries beyond which public improvements do not benefit us. So on the question of internal improvements, things like building roads and canals, Webster is taking a nationalist point of view and contrasting that view with that of Robert Hayne, which is very much a states' rights position, and one which sees the individual states as separate and as essentially the supreme government, even over that of the national government. So this, again, is another way of thinking about that conflict between Hayne and Webster, between South and North, between the nationalist view of the Constitution and the states' rights view of the Constitution. So that states' rights philosophy is also characterized by Webster. He explains what his understanding is of Hayne's position and that of most other Southerners. I understand the honorable gentleman from South Carolina to maintain that it is a right of the state legislatures to interfere whenever in their judgment this government transcends its constitutional limits and to arrest the operation of its laws. I understand him to maintain this right as a right existing under the Constitution, not as a right to overthrow it on the ground of extreme necessity, such as would justify violent revolution. I understand him to maintain an authority on the part of the states, thus to interfere for the purpose of correcting the exercise of power by the general government, of checking it, and of compelling it to conform to their opinion of the extent of its powers. I understand him to maintain that the ultimate power of judging of the constitutional extent of its own authority is not lodged exclusively in the general government or any branch of it, but that on the contrary the states may lawfully decide for themselves, and each state for itself, whether in a given case the act of the general government transcends its power. I understand him to insist that if the exigency of the case, in the opinion of any state government, require it, such state government may, by its own sovereign authority, annul an act of the general government which it deems plainly and palpably unconstitutional. So here Webster gives a concise summary of the states' rights philosophy. And if you know anything about the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, you'll know that many of the segregationist governments of the South continued to maintain this view that is articulated by Robert Hayne in the 1830s. Indeed, when we get to one of our final speeches, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech from 1963, you will hear King in that famous speech talk about Southern governors with their lips dripping with the words interposition and nullification. And that's precisely that states' rights philosophy that King is talking about in that famous speech. And so we see then that one of the things that Webster is addressing here is this distinct difference between the nationalist interpretation of the Constitution and the Southern states' rights interpretation of the Constitution. And Webster then, of course, responds to that. His position is that ultimately this is an absurdity, and the clearest exposition of that is the part of the speech where Webster talks about the practical application of Hayne's philosophy. where Hayne is depicted as leading a corps of militia to a customs house and requiring the federal customs officer to refuse to collect duties in South Carolina. But Webster also gives a kind of theoretical rebuttal as well. Sir, I deny this power of state legislatures altogether. It cannot stand the test of examination. Gentlemen may say that in an extreme case, a state government might protect the people from intolerable oppression. Sir, in such a case, the people might protect themselves without the aid of the state governments. Such a case warrants revolution. It must make, when it comes, a law for itself. A nullifying act of a state legislature cannot alter the case, nor make any resistance any more lawful. In maintaining these sentiments, sir, I am but asserting the rights of the people. I state what they have declared and insist on their right to declare it. They have chosen to repose this power in the general government, and I think it my duty to support it like other constitutional powers. So then Webster goes on to offer a detailed explanation of how the Constitution is supposed to work. And that's how Webster, in part, earned the nickname as the expounder of the Constitution. Again, this becomes ultimately the main issue between Hayne and Webster in this famous debate. Webster says, "It is, sir, the people's Constitution, the people's government, made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people. The people of the United States have declared that this Constitution shall be the supreme law. We must either admit the proposition or dispute their authority. The states are unquestionably sovereign so far as their sovereignty is not affected by this supreme law. But the state legislatures as political bodies, however sovereign, are yet not sovereign over the people. So far as the people have given power to the general government, so far the grant is unquestionably good, and the government holds of the people and not of the state governments. We are all agents of the same supreme power, the people. The general government and the state governments derive their authority from the same source. Neither can, in relation to the other, be called primary, though one is definite and restricted and the other general and residuary. The national government possesses those powers which it can be shown the people have conferred on it, and no more. All the rest belongs to the state governments or to the people themselves." So here's Webster, again, doing a kind of literal reading of the text of the Constitution and interpreting that as we the people who have made the Constitution. You notice also in the opening line of this passage, Webster talks about the people's government made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people. It probably wouldn't surprise you to learn that Abraham Lincoln had studied this speech, and we see a phrase very much like that come out in Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address: government of the people, by the people, for the people. And then finally, we turn to the peroration, the famous conclusion of Webster's speech. And this was the part of the speech that was reprinted on its own and often memorized by school children throughout the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th century. Webster says, "I have not allowed myself, sir, to look beyond the Union, to see what might lie hidden in the dark recess behind. I have not coolly weighed the chances of preserving liberty when the bonds that unite us together shall be broken asunder. I have not accustomed myself to hang over the precipice of disunion, to see whether with my short sight I can fathom the depth of the abyss below. Nor could I regard him as a safe counselor in the affairs of this government, whose thoughts should be mainly bent on considering not how the Union may best be preserved, but how tolerable might be the condition of the people when it should be broken up and destroyed. While the Union lasts, we have high, exciting, gratifying prospects spread out before us for us and our children. Beyond that, I seek not to penetrate the veil. God grant that in my day, at least, that curtain may not rise. God grant that on my vision never may be opened what lies behind. When my eyes shall be turned to behold for the last time the sun in heaven, may I not see him shining on the broken and dishonored fragments of a once glorious union, on states dissevered, discordant, belligerent, on a land rent with civil feuds, or drenched, it may be, in fraternal blood. Let their last feeble and lingering glance rather behold the gorgeous ensign of the Republic, now known and honored throughout the earth, still full high advanced, its arms and trophies streaming in their original luster, not a stripe erased or polluted, nor a single star obscured, bearing for its motto no such miserable interrogatory as, "What is all this worth?" nor those other words of delusion and folly, liberty first and union afterwards, but everywhere, spread all over in characters of living light, blazing on all its ample folds as they float over the sea and over the land and in every wind under the whole heavens, that other sentiment, dear to every true American heart, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. So the very famous peroration of the Webster speech, we see, again, 30 years before the Civil War, the consciousness that Webster has of the severity, of the gravity of the issues being debated in 1830. He realizes that this division, this rivalry, this sectionalism between North and South has within it the seeds of a civil war. It has the potential of leading to a land rent with civil feuds, or drenched, it may be, in fraternal blood. And so Webster offers this interpretation of the Constitution, hopes to gain a wide consensus in its favor, and uses this very passionate peroration as a way to secure that consensus. So we mentioned that this was one of the most famous speeches of Daniel Webster. It was perhaps the greatest speech ever given in the United States Senate, and its fame was immediate. It was published both in collections of orations and in various pamphlet forms. The speech was published in newspapers. Even 100 years later, the speech was commemorated in a 1930 newspaper article about Webster's reply to Hayne as the apogee of American oratory. There was even a reading of the speech done on an early 78 RPM record published by Victor Records. So a very famous speech in American history. So Daniel Webster, as we mentioned, died in 1852. While he was a senator from Massachusetts, and when he was home in Massachusetts, he lived in this house in Marshfield, Massachusetts, which he bought only a few years before the reply to Hayne. Here's a famous engraving of another painting entitled "The Last Days of Webster at Marshfield," which shows the dying Webster surrounded by his family and political associates. I have actually a copy of this engraving, a full-size framed copy of this engraving in my basement. If anybody would be interested in purchasing it, I would give you a good price. I can't hang it in my office. It's actually too big. But a very famous engraving of Webster's last days at Marshfield. And then we close here with a picture of the Daniel Webster grave at the Winslow Cemetery in Marshfield, only about a mile from his house. So if you have any questions or comments on Webster's second reply to Hayne, which again is a long speech and one of the last of the longer speeches we will read this semester, please post those questions or comments to the discussion board.